Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible. This is a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University, and I am joined by three gentlemen, all distinguished because of connections with archaeology, Bible, and because we're all good friends too. That helps. Larry Geraty, who is the co-host of this program, former president at La Sierra, and now working with the Advancement Office in a number of different capacities. You thought you were retired, but not quite so.
You're keeping me busy.
Well, we're working together on these things. So. And Dr. Warren Trenchard, who is the director of graduate programs in the HMS Richards Divinity School, professor of New Testament and Christian Beginnings, and Kent Bramlett, who is an associate professor, archaeology and ancient history, and also chair of the Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology in the Divinity School. So lots of stature here as well, and lots of interesting things that you all bring to these discussions, and thank you for that. We talked this time on this particular episode about what we call the pastoral letters. We all have had pastoral training, pastoral education. Have these books meant anything to you in that context? I mean, not just devotionally, but in terms of professions.
They do. I would imagine that each of us, when we were ordained, the preacher used passages from these letters to give us advice.
And these would be 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus,
right.
Those three, right? Others, as you're thinking.
Well, they're full of advice. I mean, that's something that one can relate to. It can be a challenge to meet some of the high standards, as of course always. But I think it's something that one feels is it's sort of approachable. It's like, this is our aim. This is what we should be.
And except for Paul's very short and specific letter to Philemon, these are the only letters associated with the name of Paul in the New Testament that are directed to persons, individuals. And they're called pastoral because these were two young pastors who, in the career of Paul, were associates of his, companions on trips that he took, signatories to some of the letters that he wrote to other Christian congregations. So he's dealing with them in terms of their ministries and the challenges that they're facing and so forth. And that's why, of course, it's so important for young pastors today to hear about this. Of course, the circumstances are different, but we can identify with the whole ethos of just entering ministry and encountering all these interesting challenges.
I think, too, that it really does resonate with people who've thought about, even in a teaching setting, one is always doing pastoral, carrying out pastoral functions. I mean, this is more, house church related? Would we say, I mean, you have officers, and we read about those. Is that more of a house church structure?
Certainly not cathedrals.
Right, not the larger churches of later times.
They were much smaller and structurally much simpler groups of people. Mission similar to the mission today, but much more primitive in their organization.
I think archaeologically, what do we have as the earliest of what we could call a building built as a church? Would the Capernaum example be a good one?
The earliest, the house.
3rd century? The one, the House of Peter, that then
The
turns
octagonal
into the octagonal church, which then,
And Dura Europos, too.
Okay.
On the Euphrates.
So, but in any case, some sort of spiritual leadership, that's what we're talking about here. We want to get to that book, those books, those letters soon, but we have some artifacts to think about. Kent, begin with what's on your side of the table, what we have here that, Paul and Timothy and Titus, I guess, would all recognize from the Roman world.
Well, I see on the table 3 different materials that these vessels are made out of. And those would be, of course, the most common, actually moving probably that direction. Clay, so your common earthenware sorts of vessels that everybody used. These are your everyday sorts of materials. potters. That was a career that occupation that every village would have had, just like our wheelwrights and bucket makers and so forth, the colonial times. And so everybody had these in their houses. You drop one, you break it, you just go out and get another one. Not a huge deal. But you can see some value increments as we go down the table.
So Larry, the value increases as one comes toward the glass, but we also have a couple more ceramic vessels.
You know, it is interesting that earliest of all came pottery, and then, later came glass. And this was the most expensive, perhaps, the metal things to make it. But after they began making metal things, the potters and the glass people began to copy the shapes that were in the metal. And so at first it works this way, sort of, and then after that it works this way, doesn't it?
There's even a fancy term, skeuomorph.
Okay, that's right.
Copying the style of...
Very good. There's a technical term. And so here we have an example in ceramic and in glass, the same type of vessel, which would be a bottle type vessel. Here's a double unguentarium, unguents being, moisture liquids of some kind. And we think that that was used in applying kohl to the eyes, which was called kohl, or eyeshadow, that kind of a thing. So you have the applicator and the actual kohl there. And then you can talk about the
metal objects here, the helmet. Paul often uses military hardware, breastplate, helmet, in different way. Well, I guess fairly consistently, but in different places throughout the letters. And then and all of these from the Roman period, a bowl and a jar here of some kind. Lamps, typical of the time period. Would we say that the two lamps on the right side, as viewers are looking at this, would be more Palestine? Do we see Herodian lamps from the 1st century very much outside of Palestine?
No, those are limited to the certainly the Jerusalem greater region.
Right. And then a couple of small artifacts here, a horse's head and a human figurine of one kind or another. So people would know these things, but I remember, Warren, you're talking not just about the physical properties, the physical uses, but something beyond that.
Well, these texts that we read that constitute the Bible, and in this case we're talking about parts of the New Testament, they came out of the stuff of life. And just as today we use metaphorical and symbolic references to the things that we have, that we use and so forth, they did as well. And they could talk about earthen vessels, and they could talk about lamps having various kinds of metaphorical meanings, sometimes spiritual, sometimes physical, whatever the case may be. But that shows that these texts were dealing with real people in real life circumstances, and they could extrapolate from that into talking about their beliefs and concepts and so forth.
So what discipline, among the disciplines of people who study ancient things, is the best equipped to get us to the kinds of applications from this to the metaphor, and catching what the original use was, and therefore moving then to an interpretation? So what discipline might do that well?
Well, I think you're setting us up to present the gospel of archaeology.
Oh,
there.
it works.
But I could also argue that texts are very important as well,
right.
because they not only identify many of these kinds of things, but they make the connections very often. So they must go together.
Coming from a text person, I understand that. So, well, we want to look at the book in its context. Now we'll do the literary context. So we've done some archaeological context. We'll do some literary. And if we think about the Roman Empire, the geopolitics of the world, the Mediterranean is under what we call Pax Romana. What would that allow, Kent, in the Mediterranean world?
Trade, communication, economic development for peripheral regions, or what they had been on the edge of civilization earlier. And communication, I mean, think about these letters, Timothy and Titus. You can write to someone that's in another, formerly a different country even, now a different province perhaps of the Roman Empire. And it will, with reliability, maybe a letter would get lost from time to time, a ship would go down, but generally your mail would get there. And that was something new. I don't know of any earlier time in history when you could communicate across these vast expanses of the circum-Mediterranean world as you could now in the first century.
And it was a peaceful time in general. Of course, the Roman armies had to conquer these areas, but once the outliers were conquered, they could communicate peacefully. They could spend their money on business and on trade and things like that, rather than in weaponry and killing each other, right?
That's right. Augustus, formerly Octavian, Augustus suffered a terrible loss as he was trying to push the empire into Germany across the Rhine River. And he decided, after that loss of 3 legions, he decided to focus on just building up the empire and the infrastructure. And so for 200 years, there were no wars really within the Roman Empire. That's hence the 200 years of Pax Romana. And that set, I think, the imperial direction for centuries.
I wonder,
And you find also that when these armies went out and conquered, and when they were engaged in the maintenance of those victories, they were able to do so efficiently and effectively because of a tremendous road system that they put in place in order for this to occur. But then this became, the rest of the population became the benefactors of that. And that's what enabled this travel and the ability to communicate with correspondence and the ability of people like Paul and his delegations to move all over the eastern part of the Mediterranean world.
see, that was actually going to be my next question for you, Warren. What effect does Pax Romana have on the explosive nature of the gospel in the Mediterranean world?
Well, it was that. Plus, also, I think it's fair to say that one of the most important contributions of Rome to our civilization is law. And so it was peaceful, but it was under Roman law. Things were governed in order. And as Paul is moving around, he encounters that side of the Roman government. He encounters justice. He encounters the intricacies of how the law impacts him. Christians were under a general protection that was given to Jews and some other kinds of religions of the time. And it wasn't until the latter half of the first century that was shattered and Christians began to be singled out.
And wouldn't it be true that as a Roman citizen, Paul had special privileges as he moved around the empire that you wouldn't have if you were a slave, for instance?
Yeah, people would beat up Paul, throw stones at him and bang. He's lying on the ground there, and he'd say something like, "That's not a nice thing to do to a Roman citizen." And they would go crazy, because it had a real power.
Right.
It had a real franchise when you could roll that out.
Right. Okay, well, okay, we will look at a couple more maps. This one showing Paul's second journey, and then the next one, Paul's third journey. When does Paul encounter these underlings, these apprentices in ministry?
The answer, Doug, is simply, we don't know. Because by the time we come to these materials, we've sort of run out of that outline of Paul's career and so forth that we find in the book of Acts. Acts has Paul on the way to Rome after he appealed to Caesar when he was in Palestine and was arrested because of a turmoil there. And so he was taken to Rome. The setting of these pastoral epistles, particularly 2 Timothy, is after that. And it assumes that Paul actually was released and continued his ministry and made plans for even more expansive outreach all the way to the western part of the Mediterranean. So it causes us some problem to try to date these.
We will keep thinking about that. And then we're going to turn to you at the end of the day to really to give us the answer.
Have
right?
mercy.
A chronology of the Roman period as standard with anything tied to Paul. we're talking about these two emperors and their influence. A list of what are called Pauline letters, and at the bottom of the list, the pastorals, okay, letters to Timothy and the letter to Titus. Let's look at a wider context question. And Warren, let's talk about what it means for these letters in terms of audience, authorship, maybe when we could expect them to show up, but again, you've suggested that's a tough one.
Well, in some earlier episodes, we talked a little bit about the issue of authorship, particularly as it relates to the New Testament, but this could be true of any part of the Bible. We have a particular standard understanding of authorship. Here's the person who wrote something, they get it published, it goes out under their name, over their name, and so forth. In the ancient world, that certainly was a possibility. There were people all the time who were writing things and publishing things, even though it was more difficult to do so than today. But the name of a person could be associated with a writing for a variety of reasons that would go, in some cases, beyond the notion of that person being the literal author. In some cases, pupils or students, followers, some years later, would write something in the name of their teacher or their mentor, as addressing some issue that how they would feel that their mentor would address in their day.
And maybe they had heard their mentor talk about that specific issue.
And some of those things may have been already written about, but in a more embryonic way, in some other genuine writing. Sometimes a community would venerate somebody who maybe founded that Christian community or was a particularly important visitor to it or something like that, or some tie back to the disciples or apostles or to Jesus himself. And sometimes writings seem to have been named in honor of these kinds of people. And there were other types of things as well. So we shouldn't be surprised when sometimes the variety of ways of understanding authorship also turns up among New Testament letters.
Old Testament letters too, Old Testament books.
Yes, I'm sure. And so it is broad consensus, though not true of everyone's views, that these letters were written by Paul's followers later on, probably remembering certain kinds of interactions that Paul had with these young pastors, but laying out things that would be helpful to an expanding church, a growing kind of structure and organization that seems to have, that's described there, that seems to be later than Paul's time, the very reference to deacons and elders and bishops and so forth, certainly is reflective of a later time, and probably was beginning to be seen in some embryonic way then. But generally, we tend to see this as after the time of Paul.
And so to church audiences, I use the word plural,
right.
Would these be used fairly widely? I mean, they're directed to people, but these people, I assume, would share the contents with various church leaders and so on?
They're directed to people, but they're really directed to communities who are facing the kinds of issues that are described there. And how are they going to select appropriate leaders for themselves? What kind of roles should these leaders have? And these are both male and female leaders, which is interesting because they both the writings to Timothy and to Titus address that sort of broad gender leadership of the church at the time.
Well, let's look then, a quick look through the outlines. 1 Timothy, I don't know, Warren, if there's anything in here that resonates with what you were just talking about that you want to mention.
Well, certainly on instructions on church order, that's what I was referring to with regard to leadership.
And then in 2 Timothy.
Yes, there's more sort of direct instruction to Timothy as the presumed recipient of this, but also some interesting things on Paul's situation, which is his emergence out of jail and into this sort of second career and so forth. And the anticipation that things are not going well and he's likely to be back in that environment again.
And requests for fairly mundane things.
Right.
But we can find some...
He wants some things from his library.
Right. And then Titus...
And it's apparently cold because he wants some...
A coat. He wants his outer coat. Right. And so here, really closely argued, closely listed instructions, guidelines.
And very parallel to the kind of materials we have in 1 Timothy.
Righto. Okay, some archaeological issues. This word, Eusebia, what, piety? Is that, I mean, that's what we've put here. Is that a good definition? Doesn't show up in the other Pauline letters, as far as we know.
And that's an example of how one of the indicators of how we would suspect that this is probably a follower of Paul who's writing, because while he's picking up some Pauline ideas, he or she, whoever is writing, is using other terms, other language, other concepts and topics.
And of course, later, the very famous historian Eusebius gets his name from the same word.
We also have a couple things to say about law in the Roman world. We'll compare that with Judaism and the Jewish law system. And we even have some images of people praying, men and women praying. So as far as Torah, Old Testament law is concerned, the word law is probably not the best term to use to describe it. It's more of a divine gift to give instruction and guidelines.
Teaching, maybe.
It's teaching, instruction, a pointing of the way, as one author put it. So this is a significant Hebraic understanding of how God gives guidance to help and rescue his people. I mean, it's a gift of grace. That's what it is. What would we say about Roman law? Could we say the same? I mean, it's structured quite differently and probably perceived quite differently.
Well, the codification of Roman law goes back to the 5th century, not long after you think of the famous Greek lawgiver Solon, who also codified law. But the attempt is to make the law applicable to everybody. And so it presents then 12 tables of law that apply to everybody. Nobody then is exempt from this. And that becomes a model. It's used then in the Roman Empire. And of course, law is one of the great cultural items that's bequeathed to the successor civilizations that arise in Europe. So this is very important, tracing back the Western legal system.
I understand resistance from the elite to the writing down, to the codification of the law, that middle of the 5th century. And then I think this is an interesting graphic, I mean an outline here. A number of things, and we'll not look at all of them, but a number of things which Roman law, by equalizing, by giving justice for all, and access to law, and access to the court system, is so much a forerunner of today's modern democracies. So, okay, we have depictions of people in prayer. I don't know if in your pastoring days or in your church role as a church elder or on the church board, if people ever argued about how you're supposed to pray. What would we have to say from the pastorals?
Back in my day, you couldn't do this.
That's right. That's right. But here, this is the standard way of praying.
Right.
So we have this one from Catacombs. Another, this time a woman in a catacomb. I have heard people read the passage that, this is King James, that the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Okay, I really went back to an old translation on that one. But is it possible that women could pray too? Well, we certainly have it in the Christian tradition. But, for instance, here in the catacombs.
And interesting, when you talk about women in prayer, and to go back to the concept of church order that you find in 1 Timothy and Titus, there's not only a set of criteria identified for how men can function in leadership roles, but there's also a set of criteria for how women can function in leadership roles. And the interesting figure here is a widow. And we don't have that, we have elders and deacons today, and some Christian communities have bishops, an overseer. But I don't know of any that continue the tradition of widows constituting a church leadership function. And there's a lot of different things that these widows are charged with doing, and a set of criteria for how they can qualify to be in that. And one thing is interesting is that both the elder bishop on one hand and the woman who is a widow who is legitimately enrolled as such, they are both described in terms of marriage. The man to be an elder must be the husband of one wife, and the widow must be the wife of one husband. Now, it can't imply that she's married, because by definition, that a widow is unmarried. Was married, but not married. So this is not intended to limit leadership just to those people who are the husbands of one wife. Leadership also extends to the wives of one husband, probably in each case referring to faithfulness to the spouses that they had, and maybe even some things like they haven't entered into a second marriage of some sort. But the same criterion is used for the woman as well as a man.
You have to think about this much more in much more egalitarian terms.
Right, right.
We are going to think about widows and women's roles. We don't have a lot of time left on this episode, but widows, or real widows, as some of the translations put it. And we have family ties again. That shows up in all of these letters. So we have marriage and family. I'm just going to scoot through these quickly so that we have a
Notice the egalitarian nature of the people depicted, even though sometimes if it's a funerary thing, the man is up front.
Right, right. So we have a number of different depictions. And then I couldn't find anything that depicted a widow specifically, but this book does. So if you buy this book, you'll find out a lot about widows. And what you were talking about is really going to mean something in the context of a book like that. And then we have children, lots of children. And then we move out of that, the male and female imagery and leadership roles, to metaphors. This one, a farmer, and then soldiers. So we have that. And then I wanted to say something about, and I actually have Warren say something about texts. It's a short response that you'll need.
Well, this is one of the earliest manuscripts of Paul's letters in that portion of the New Testament. You can see it's written on papyrus. The ragged edges of this show how this is glued together in two different directions. It was very difficult to write on, and so Paul very often used professional scribes to write on this. In the letter to the Romans, one by the name of Tertius says, I'm the one who actually wrote this out. So he apparently was skilled in writing on these kind of things.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Ken. And thank all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.